for the Dreamcast presents such a wonderfully creative and fucking crazy horror vision, it simply must be played to be believed. Despite all its indisputable problems, despite all the times it frustrated the absolute crap out of me, it is one of the greatest games I have ever played. Both in its gameplay and presentation, there's never been anything like it. Standing in defiance of not only the survival horror genre, it has more in common with Minesweeper than Resident Evil, but also in defiance of how a video game can frame itself. I am of course echoing what I said about another crazy Dreamcast horror game, Kenji Eno's D2. But unlike D2, Illbleed seldom aims to make philosophical statements, instead going weird for the sake of just getting fucking weird. And for me, that makes it a better game, albeit still one with a myriad of problems. The video games as art argument has never really interested me, but by its peerless presentation alone, Illbleed stands to confirm that video games are certainly a legitimate form of entertainment and a legitimate medium of creativity. But if that's too pretentious a statement, simply put, if you love horror, you need to play Illbleed. Alright, so now that I've given unbelievable praise to Illbleed, let me make it clear that this game has problems. I still thoroughly enjoyed this game, but it wouldn't be right if I didn't talk about the game's faults. One fault is doing a very poor job of explaining how this game works. And just like I felt it was my duty to explain that in Nightshade you have to hide behind the wall first, if I'm gonna recommend Illbleed, I should explain what you're supposed to do. And it's convenient because the best way to both warn you of the game's faults and show you the game's triumphs is to walk you through the first of 6 levels. I'll explain why in a minute. This spoils practically nothing, so here we go. It's Michael Reynolds' virtual horror land, Illbleed. The title screen sets the mood with a wonderfully spooky piano theme. And this is a good time to mention that Illbleed really isn't scary, it's just a fun, spooky horror romp. So if you've never had the wherewithal to venture into Silent Hill, consider Illbleed. But like any horror game, the only way to play it is in the dark. Oh, and I also highly recommend a rumble pack for this game. The opening cinema introduces us to our characters, and we're given a bit of backstory to Eriko Christie. When she was young, her father ran a traveling haunted house, and in what could only be described as truly awful parenting, he tested his traps on her. Jesus, where the hell was the CPS? But because of this, she gained an interest in horror movies, and in high school, became president of the Horror Movie Research Club. We meet her other friends, Kevin, Michelle, and my boy, Randy, aka the best one of the 4. The lack of lip movement adds to the cheesiness, allowing the vocal performances to feel more natural, unbound by lip syncing.
Sounds like we're trying to be superheroes or something.
Its cheesiness feels genuine. Illbleed delivers on exactly what it sets out to be, deliberately corny as hell. And every syllable that pours out of Randy's mouth is gold.
I'd use the money for a chainsaw.
Unfortunately, you don't get a chance to use him until the 4th level. Anyway, the gang receives invitations to Illbleed, the deadliest amusement park in the world. A regular itchy and scratchy land. Believe it or not, Illbleed does feature a scene of unnecessary surgery, but very few explosions and no searing gas pain. There's a $100 million reward for surviving the park, but no one has survived yet. And rumor has it that 100 people die every day in Illbleed. For the Horror Movie Research Club, it's an opportunity they simply cannot pass up. However, because of her upbringing, Eriko's not interested, so the rest of the gang goes off without her. However, her 3 friends never return, and now Eriko must go to Illbleed to save them. It's fun, but all this doesn't amount to as much as you'd think, as the game is not really about these kids. It's just to set up the conceit of the park. Most of the game takes place in 6 movies, each with their own stories that play out regardless of who you play as. You're literally playing an anthology horror film, culminating in the 6th and final stage, which is one of the craziest things I've ever seen in a video game. There's a bit of progressive narrative for our heroes, and a few fourth-wall breaking jokes involving the amusement park staff for good measure, but most time devoted to exposition is spent developing the level you're currently in. And I'd say each level had both an interesting premise and an interesting conclusion. Every one was great. Speaking of which, let's get started with the first one. You begin in the lobby where you can't really do a whole lot because you don't have a whole lot of money. You can go to the graveyard for a tutorial, but it doesn't explain much more than the controls and give you a couple items. Just head straight up the stairs to the movie theater and enter the first movie, The Home Run of Death. God, this game is great. So after a fun little introduction, the game right away makes an odd choice by placing an unavoidable trap at the entrance. It doesn't hurt you, but it's kind of a shitty way to start things off. So let me explain what's going on here. You've got more than just life. You've got to manage a heart rate and bleeding. Now you'll see here I've lost health, I'm bleeding, and a little spooked, so my heart rate is going. Your life, heart rate, and bleeding all affect each other in logical ways, and any three can kill you if not treated. Now, how do you avoid traps like this? With your horror monitor, but for whatever reason you have to find it in each level. The whole thing is moot because it's always found in the very beginning of every level. However, in the case of the very first level, the horror monitor is in the far corner of the map. The first time I played this game, I wasn't aware exploration was so key, so I entered the house without finding it, and was left completely helpless and confused. Anyway, once you've got the horror monitor, check out the rest of the yard before heading in. You've got to know how to use it. And now's a good time to explain what's up with your senses up there at the top. All characters have finely tuned senses that react when you're near a shock event, or as I'd rather call them, a spook. Now, spotting a spook doesn't mean a thing if you haven't marked it, so once you've got a beat on one, pull out your horror monitor and mark it. Now here's where the game is more akin to Minesweeper than Resident Evil. Illbleed is riddled with red herrings. Flag a red herring and you've wasted precious adrenaline, which fuels your horror monitor. Successfully flag a spook and you'll be rewarded with adrenaline. Here, I've flagged 4 potential spooks, but only one was an actual spook. Your senses come into play when it comes to differentiating between a spook and a red herring. For instance, your hearing senses are spiking, so the spook is probably the phone, not the newspaper. There are times when you can't parse out where the spook is and you just have to gamble. Items like energy drinks and newspaper articles are what trigger your 6th sense, meaning that flagging an item is also a waste of adrenaline. And speaking of wasting adrenaline, just pulling out your horror monitor costs you, so make sure you've got a beat before you push the R button. Heading inside the house gives you plenty of practice. Right here in the lobby are a bunch of items, spooks, and red herrings. Also, lots to look at. Some Dreamcast games hold up, and visually, Illbleed is one of them. Down the hallway at the end, you'll learn a very valuable lesson. Your 6th sense does not just spot items, it also spots enemy encounters, and usually there's no way of knowing the difference. This introduces another awful thing about Illbleed. Its combat is pretty busted. You have 2 options when fighting enemies. You can risk life and limb by fighting, which will reward you with extra adrenaline, or pound the B button by the H icon to escape by helicopter. Yes, by helicopter. Now at this point you don't have a proper weapon, only your fists, so you're better off just avoiding this fight. But I want to talk more about Illbleed's combat. First off, the controls are laggy. Attacking isn't responsive. Long-range weapons acquired later in the game don't help as much as you'd hope because enemies are also too damn resilient. They can take forever to kill. Now the crazy geyser of blood makes connecting with your enemy satisfying at least. What keeps Illbleed from completely breaking at this point is that there are no tank controls, something that prevents me from going back to Onimusha, and an extremely useful dodge button. But the way the dodge button is handled, it feels more like a cop-out than a genuine attempt to balance the game. Simply hit the A button and you're invincible for a second or so. And I mean totally invincible. It doesn't matter where you sidestep to, just so long as you sidestep. Hey boss, should we make the enemies slower or maybe give them less health? Nah, just make an invincibility button. To be fair, sidestepping raises your heart rate very quickly, but this never stopped me from hammering on that A button. Illbleed, though, has far fewer encounters than a Resident Evil or Silent Hill, so this, plus the invincibility button, save a combat system that comes dangerously close to undermining the entire experience of Illbleed. It gets the job done, but it is consistently one of the game's biggest sources of frustration. But let's not stay grumpy, let's keep going. Eventually you'll find a courtyard, and keep an eye on your 6th sense, and you'll eventually spot a baseball bat that brings up this little cutscene.
Jimmy, it's time for practice! Get out to the training field now! Hey, you're not Jimmy!
Yeah folks, this game is fucking weird, and you ain't seen nothing yet. You also have a bat now, so if you're hurting for some adrenaline, go bust some heads. But anyway, keep running through the house. This level, like most, is pretty linear. You'll find lots of spooks, items, and monsters. You'll learn more about Jimmy and his father, Mr. Bambalo. Eventually, we'll meet him, and look at that character model! Games may grow old, but good character models always look good. After this fight, we're introduced to the chase sequence. These are actually kind of spooky, definitely got a couple of jumps out of me. And eventually we'll vanquish Mr. Bambalo and save Kevin. But then what the fuck is that? Exactly. And it's just an amusement park, right? By the way, this park can be a pain in the ass, but just remember, dodge button. So you might be saying, yo, Happy Nerd, what's with all the spoilers? Well, trust me. A crazy zombie man brandishing a flamethrower missing half a butt cheek is the tip of the iceberg, my friends. I couldn't tell you how many times I laughed hysterically or was left slack-jawed by the crazy places this game took me. And that's because there are 6 stages. They not only have their own stories, characters, and twists, they more importantly have their own framework. Start up the second level and almost immediately it's a completely different experience. They make a goof about your horror monitor being stolen by monkeys, because you don't need it. The second level is completely different from the first, and that's the genius thing about Illbleed. It spends the entire first level setting up a framework only to systematically break it down as each level sees fit. This reaches a fever pitch on the 6th level, where they throw everything out the window and just tell a crazy, ridiculous story for the sake of telling a crazy, ridiculous story. It amounts to an incredibly ambitious game that offers an almost completely different game 6 different times. It absolutely has problems, a handful of which I didn't even mention, but Illbleed isn't afraid to retool itself to tell a bonkers story, so it is an experience that is worth the stress. Illbleed is the type of game that you've probably heard of but never played, and I don't blame you. It was released in April of 2001, a few months after Sega killed the Dreamcast and bowed out of the hardware business. Even though it was given what is probably the greatest and most appropriate trailer of all time, promising to make you, quote, shit with fear, most people had already given up on the Dreamcast and were probably playing Onimusha on their PlayStation 2s. Not to mention, this is when the Resident Evil and Silent Hill games actually mattered, and Illbleed couldn't be further from the pack. The game's best ending hints at a sequel. However, in 2004, Crazy Games merged with a larger company and most of the Illbleed team was lost. Furthermore, mastermind Shinaya Nishigaki passed away a few months after the merger, taking with him any chance for a true sequel. There were also plans to bring this game to the Xbox, but those plans were eventually scrapped. It's just the way things go sometimes. A few years back, I reviewed another weird Dreamcast horror title, D2. Now, like Illbleed, D2 also features extremely interesting gameplay without equal. It also features a deep, rich story sprawled over 4 discs that I personally found incomprehensible and overwhelming. However, I didn't mean to sound disrespectful. D2 mastermind Kenji Eno deserves praise for believing that video games could tell such an ambitious story. And there are certain parts to Illbleed that made me think, if this were a cartoon or a film, it just wouldn't be the same. However, there's no accounting for taste, and I fully acknowledge that the story of D2 just wasn't for me. However, when it comes to weird horror games, these two are a bit of a yin and yang. If you want horror and you want unique, get D2 for a thought-provoking mindbender, or get Illbleed for unfettered lunacy. If Resident Evil and Silent Hill are, say, Dawn of the Dead and Halloween, well then Illbleed is House, Dead Alive, or Dr. Giggles. That super weird, kind of flawed, slightly obscure, but still essential horror classic. It's not the cheapest game out there, but I'd say it's totally worth the money. And now, back by actual popular demand, more Halloween jokes. Let's do this. Why couldn't the ghost see its mom and dad? Because they were trans parents. Why do ghosts like to ride in elevators? It raises their spirits. Why don't ghosts like the rain? It dampens their spirits. Why do people actually want to see more of these? Fuck.